I made a discovery, so it's time to share it with you. I am Joseph, and this is Input English. In a recent video, I told you that I was reading Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because I wanted to review that as a possible source of input for you. But since I had not read that book in decades, I figured it would be a terrible disservice to give you some ramblings from my distant past, some vague memories, and a lousy review. I wanted to do a better job, and so I vowed to reread Frankenstein. So I got a hold of a copy of Frankenstein. I am now about 1/4 of the way through. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein and published it in 1818. So that work is very much a product of the era just before the Industrial Revolution, early 19th century. It is a Gothic novel. She describes very gloomy surroundings and puts a lot of effort into describing grief and sorrow. The language of that novel was a product of that era. That is, it was a relatively archaic form of English compared to the way we speak or write today. There were a lot of terms that one could learn, but they are archaic terms which are not used in the present time. She talked about a person's countenance, their face, or their lineaments, their features. So there's a lot of archaic terminology in that book. One could find that a little off-putting. I will continue reading this book. Don't get me wrong, I'm not abandoning Frankenstein. I will read it, and I will report back to you after I complete that read. But the discovery I made was how similar the beginning of it was, at least the feeling of the beginning of it, was to another book that I read. That book is Dracula. Dracula was written much later. It was published in London in 1897. So many generations after Frankenstein, Dracula was published. There is a common connection in the minds of people, at least in the United States, between Dracula and Frankenstein. That connection is probably most related to motion pictures. These two books were made into classic horror movie motion pictures, and the version of Dracula that comes to mind to me was portrayed by Bela Lugosi. In my generation, he was Dracula. The classic film version of Frankenstein featured Lon Chaney as the creature. Images from these two classic horror movies, which came from these two classic Gothic horror novels, are everywhere in society now. Cartoons are made depicting these images. It is common for people, children in particular, to refer to the creature created by Frankenstein as Frankenstein. Those of us who have read the book know that the monster from Frankenstein was the creature or the monster, and that Frankenstein was Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist. Dracula was written in an epistolary style, a pattern of writing where the book is made up of letters and diary entries. Frankenstein, in contrast, is written in a semi-epistolary fashion. It starts out with letters and then it moves into the big narrative, which is divided into books, and then the books are divided into chapters. When I began reading Frankenstein, my mind was quickly drawn to similarities with Dracula. So let's shift gears here and change our attention to the book by Bram Stoker, Dracula. I read that book during the pandemic. It was an interesting experience because during the pandemic, we were scared. During the early pandemic, we were not vaccinated. We didn't know how bad this pandemic was going to be, and we didn't know if we were going to survive it. This was the backdrop for me reading Dracula. The suggestion for me to read Dracula came from Ben McAvoy. The experience of reading Dracula taught me several things. One, it taught me that one can easily read 2 or 3 books at one time, courtesy of having a bookmark. During that time in the pandemic, I was typically reading 3 books at a time, usually 1 nonfiction and 2 fiction books at any given time. The reason that happened is because I found the vivid description of the horror of Dracula so overwhelming that I had to put it down. When we select books, one of the superlatives we might give a book is that it's a page turner. That is, it is so engaging and so riveting that we just keep reading and turning pages and we can't put it down. Well, for me, Dracula was very much that kind of a book. The tension was so great that it got to a point I had to put it down. I couldn't endure it any longer. So even though it drew me into the story, perhaps it drew me in too much. So I had to put it down in self-defense. That's how I learned that I could read multiple books at the same time with no harm. There's no downside to that. I think the epistolary organization of Dracula tremendously adds to the tension because the reader knows that these messages are being sent very slowly to the recipient, and it creates this question in your mind whether he has already perished. What's going on? Because you know about that delay of the delivery of these messages. As I compare the experience of reading Dracula versus reading Frankenstein, the striking difference is that Dracula is much easier to read. The nearly 80 years difference in the timing of their authorship made a big difference in the language. Dracula was written just before the beginning of the 20th century, so I found the language in it very easy to consume. Of the 2 books, you're much more likely to smoothly read through Dracula and not get hung up on the vocabulary as compared to Frankenstein. The reason I am sharing this information with you is twofold. One, comments in the comment section frequently reflect people's concerns about not understanding what they are reading and having to spend time looking words up. Everyone watching this channel seems to know how inefficient that is if you have to stop and look up a word. The other reason I'm sharing this information is my experience reading Cien Años de Soledad. I disclosed in a previous video that I am reading that fine work by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I have gotten into that book one chapter, and I find it very difficult. What I found is that the language is very flowery and poetic, and I found that the vocabulary in that book contains a lot of words that I simply do not know. So it's been a real slow go. My habit with content is to read things beginning to end, or watch videos beginning to end. My habit is with videos to repeat them, not immediately, but maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, using spacing and interleaving to increase my learning from those works. With Cien Años de Soledad, I have come to a stop. I'm not giving up on that book, but I am going to postpone it in my reading because it's just too much of a struggle, and I need to keep learning things that are more enjoyable. I do not want to put a big obstacle in front of myself by choosing something that is above my level. This is not a defeat. This is a decision. I think in terms of this decision being stewardship of my learning process. We make decisions every day about the content we absorb, but we need those decisions to be good decisions. We get advice, we start consuming the content, and then we respond to that content. And I would submit that it is not a defeat to put something aside to wait for our level to catch up to where we can really understand what that book is saying to us and enjoy it. So if you would like to explore a classic Gothic novel, horror novel that is easy to understand, written in a language that will not create big problems for you, I would suggest that you take a look at Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now that I can compare the Frankenstein novel to the Dracula novel, I can say with confidence that Dracula is much easier to read, much easier to understand, and the language is much more similar to modern English. I invite comments below, and if you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.